Okay, great. All right, so first of all, thank you so much for attending this talk. I'm actually really excited to have this opportunity to discuss my research and to perhaps shed a bit of light on the current outbreak. Now, when Katrina and I first had a discussion about this talk months ago, I was going to present on something slightly different. In doing my research, writing my dissertation, and thinking about pandemic outbreaks, I realized that there was actually a bit of a gap between what I researched on the ground by looking at the challenges, concerns, and anxieties of my 19th century physicians and politicians, and the reality of how scientists and specialists think about epidemic outbreaks, specifically in the way that they conceive of containment and prevention. Now, while the scientific community was and is doing a lot to prepare for such an outbreak by running simulations and pinpointing issues within our own healthcare system, and adopting a very proactive approach by cataloging and studying cross-species mutations around the world, it seemed that from a scientific perspective, there were universal and stagnant categories of hygiene. Now, what I mean by this is that there was a strong assumption that if the World Health Organization came out with a list of precautionary measures that needed to be followed, that they would be understood by everyone across race, class, gender, and culture. Or as we have seen, unfortunately, with our current outbreak, that those measures can be followed by everyone and don't come at a great cost to those who are not privileged enough to be able to stay at home or call off sick, or that governments are able to implement the best plan to manage them. Now, I won't say that science is not moving in the direction to understand the important social cultural norms, following and understanding medical procedures, or that physicians on the ground that often have to deal with such outbreaks don't understand the challenges this pose, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. Now, we saw this become an issue actually with the Ebola outbreak, and the huge problem that physicians actually had in containing the spread of this disease. Now, the custom of caring for the sick and importance of funeral rites became a huge problem. Now, the talk that I was going to give was going to argue quite effectively that we need to start looking at these social cultural differences and responses to epidemic outbreaks to better prepare ourselves. And that while science can help us understand how illness spreads, as well as provide treatments and perhaps a cure, that history and a historical perspective can bring important nuance to this process. Because despite the great technological and scientific innovations we have, epidemic outbreaks are still occurring. Now, it would seem initially that I'm going against everything that history teaches us, that you can remove something from its context and that it will still work and be relevant. But epidemic disease, that is high impact infectious diseases, makes sense intellectually as a category of analysis. They are and were experienced differently than other chronic diseases and give rise to distinct fears and anxieties like scapegoating, mass hysteria, and outbursts of religiosity. So epidemic outbreaks are distinct and have left a legacy that we can follow. Now, I believe that every outbreak is an opportunity for us to learn, because it's not if an outbreak will occur, but when one will occur. Viruses and bacteria do not abide by treaties or acknowledge the sovereignty of nations. Viruses and bacteria do not wait in line to get a visa before they enter a country. They're opportunistic. If an opportunity exists for an infection will occur, because it's not if an outbreak will happen, but when. In the last few decades, we have seen the reemergence of older diseases. There have been outbreaks in the United States of measles and mumps, which in the 80s, there was such great hope that they, like smallpox, would become eradicated. This has also raised new concerns about anti-vaccination and individual rights. Further, we have seen the rise of newer, much deadlier diseases like SARS, H1N1, Ebola, and now COVID-19. Now, as the scientific community prepares and continues to attempt to protect us from such outbreaks by assessing where we are vulnerable in our level of preparedness, we need to consider as well how hygienic norms are interpreted and the best way to really bridge this gap. But I'm afraid that my talk is actually a bit late since we find ourselves in the middle of an epidemic outbreak. Now there are really different questions that need to be answered about how and when this will end, how it might play out, and what we can actually do to help this crisis. Now my talk is actually going to be split into two parts. Now in the first part, I will discuss my research and some of the major issues my dissertation explores. I will also address what history brings to this discussion about disease and illness and why I personally believe it's so important. Now the second part will actually be modeled after how we teach the history of epidemics class. I will give a mini science/epidemiology lesson on what we actually know about this virus. I find that despite all the information being spread, some of the language that is being used is and can be misleading and ambiguous. There is also a lot of misinformation and confusion about numbers, data, and other studies that are being circulated. Now today is April 2nd. Since our outbreak is still ongoing, there is still a lot that we do not know about the current situation. All of the technical information that I will give about COVID-19 is based on what we know up to this point, and it comes from the CDC, the World Health Organization, the COVID Task Force, and other US health agencies. Tomorrow and in the future, this might change, so please keep that in mind. In addition, I will not be providing up-to-date numbers on infection or death rates for the United States. Now, the reason for this is that in the United States, we actually do not have accurate data on how many people are sick because of lack of proper testing. As a result, looking at the bell curve of infection is not accurate since we don't have the complete picture. So predicting when this will end or if it's slowing down is really a lot of guesswork. In addition, sudden spikes in cases has to do more with testing and more testing being available than whether the virus is actually spreading or not. We're probably just catching up with the people that have been sick. As a result, numbers at this point actually tell us very little. We will have to wait to see how April and testing pans out there. Focusing on these numbers is actually leading to more panic and confusion. Now then I will discuss the challenges and questions my physicians and politicians faced in the 19th century by exploring the current COVID-19 outbreak. Now along the way, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. I will have time for questions and answers at the end. Now my dissertation is actually titled The Healing Nation, Hygiene, Sanitation, and the Public Health Enterprise in Spain. Now I look at the rise of modern epidemics, beginning with the global pandemic of cholera in the 1830s and ending with the outbreak of influenza in 1918. Now, while my dissertation is rooted in 19th century concerns of state building, policing, and sanitation, a larger argument I'm attempting to make by crafting it the way that I am is that epidemic outbreaks cannot and should not be left to scientists and physicians alone. As we have seen with the specific outbreak and the new idea of social distancing, we all have to work together to keep everyone safe. And how we handle questions about our own health and global health will determine how we survive as a species. In addition, larger questions about public health open up discussions about access and responsibility. Who has access to healthcare and why? Who is deserving of attention? And whose responsibility is it actually to manage health? We all have to make a series of decisions and choices when we choose to live in society. And as a result, questions that can be asked about epidemic outbreaks go beyond the realm of science to how we choose to organize our society and are a key component to how we think about history. Now, the introduction of cholera to the European continent is a key moment for my dissertation. While there were other diseases that were a concern in the 19th century, like smallpox and yellow fever, cholera is a brand new infection. It had never been seen in the European continent. As a result, there was no real treatment, and the contaminant remained unknown until the late 19th century. Now, people began to guess that it might come from contaminated water sources, but certainty of the bacterium involved did not come into much later. Now, cholera was exotic and had an unknown character. It presented agonizing and gruesome symptoms. It also had a high case fatality. It seemed to have a predilection for adults in their prime, and it also, many of the symptoms seemed to resemble that of the plague. And lastly, an epidemic outbreak of this magnitude had not occurred since the Black Plague. In many ways, this kind of crisis was one that only vaguely survived in the memory of politicians and 19th century physicians. Now, some of the questions that I had initially when I began my research was how prepared was the Spanish crown to deal with such an outbreak? What, if any, organization/administration did they have to move resources and fight this outbreak? And lastly, how far in advance did they know it was coming? Now, I realized as I researched that many of these questions were actually based on faulty assumptions on my part. My assumption was that if they had enough time, they could have easily stopped it, right? Or my other assumption that if it wasn't stopped, it was because they fundamentally lacked some sort of understanding. Now, as I researched more and looked at responses from France, Britain, and the US and elsewhere, I realized that there was another reason for a variation in response. But let's look at what the Spanish crown was up to first. Now, the Spanish crown knew months in advance, about a year actually, that there was a new disease that was making its way across the world. It was known as Asiatic cholera, or sometimes called Cholera morbus. Now, the crown organized itself the best way that it knew how. It implemented the Junta de Sanidad Suprema. Now, this was not a permanent institution, but one that was called upon when there was a threat of an epidemic outbreak. It also prepared to implement quarantine regulations on ships, set up local sanitation boards, and began to call physicians back from retirement. So anybody that was a medical doctor before, I have records where they're petitioned to come back. It also developed a really early alert system where physicians had to report any cases of cholera. Now, once cholera entered Spain, it set up sanitary cordons where whole neighborhoods and towns were isolated to minimize the spread of infection. It organized temporary epidemic hospitals, often in churches in Spain, to help with overcrowding, and it also suspended borough regulations in order to ensure that there was no further contamination. Now, unfortunately, as early actually as 1831, the Spanish newspaper Gaceta de Madrid started to report on choleric outbreaks internationally. And by June 12th of 1834, cholera reports started to be announced in the newspaper of outbreaks inside of Spain. For example, Cádiz reported 9 patients who were reported to have said that they had cholera, but the town argued that the threat was contained and that there was no threat of infection. But the implementation of many of these tactics, like long quarantines and isolation, also came with its own set of problems. And these are issues that we see actually throughout Europe. Now, some of the reactions to outbreaks of cholera, like the plague, were scapegoating, manhunts, and suspicion. Foreigners, Romani, and all outsiders became suspected of causing cholera. For those who could flee, it also led to mass flights. There was also a rise in social tensions that manifested its way in different ways across Europe. Now, because in many areas, cholera disproportionately affected working class people because of poor living conditions, this led to suspicion and at times violence. Now, in some areas of Europe, there was actually very clear housing segregation, and this became even more apparent with cholera. As a result, assaults on doctors who treated areas where they did not live in tended to happen, and there was also choleric riots. Now, hospitals also became overrun and crowded, as well as temporary epidemic hospitals. But suspicion was not just from poor people towards wealthy. It also came the other way around. Wealthy and middle-class people suspected that it was the lower classes that were breeding grounds for infection. Now, you guys will see that on the slide, I have some images of some housing conditions, and they were definitely very overcrowded. There were single-family homes where they all shared a room. There was no running water, and so the hygienic conditions were definitely not great. Now, even though cholera was very devastating, I really wanted to look into why cholera caused such panic. And we're going to do this by actually looking at the symptoms of cholera. Now, the bacterium is actually quite fragile. It doesn't travel well like the Black Plague did, and it doesn't spread as easily as smallpox, but it still caused a lot of fear. Although this bacterium doesn't travel well, colonialism increased contact with areas that used to have this disease, which allowed an opportunity for transmission. New ports of trade also opened up, which allowed further areas of contamination. And there was also a transportation revolution with steamships and railroads. And lastly, cholera really thrives in chaotic, rapid, and unplanned urbanization. And in the absence of sewer systems, it allows the spread to reach new proportions. Now, another thing that made cholera so frightening was its transmission and symptoms. Now, cholera actually has a really short incubation period between 3 hours, a few hours to 3 days, depending on how much contaminated food or water you ingest. Now, the bacterium localizes in the small intestine, and the flagellum, the little tail that it has, helps it attach to the intestinal wall. Now, the main symptoms are diarrhea and vomiting. An infected individual could expel between 10 to 15 liters of fluid a day. And this rapid dehydration causes a bluish tone to be given to the skin, and that's where it gets one of its nicknames, the blue plague. Now, your body actually has a lot of special defenses. It really protected it from a lot of things. Saliva and stomach acid are definitely some of them. But the outbreak of cholera really depended on how much you ingested and how weak your immune system might be. However, if you were a poor worker in a large city, the likelihood that your nutritional requirements were being met and that you didn't have another underlying condition was very high. Now, once the bacterium enters the intestine, the body is actually quite capable of killing it, and it does so. But as your body does its best to protect you, the bacterium begins to release powerful toxins as it dies, and it forces your intestine to work in reverse. So what your small intestine does is that it dries up the food and like withdraws nutrients and gives it to the rest of your body. When it works in reverse, you begin to lose plasma and you go into hypovolemic shock before you die. Now, even though this is how we know cholera actually works, 19th century physicians thought of cholera as very elusive, and they focused actually on different symptoms, which is really interesting. To them, it was sudden and without a warning, and that makes sense, right? Depending on how much you ingested, someone might get sick much faster than you. Now, this phase tended to last between 8 to 24 hours. They also noted that your pulse gets much fainter and almost absent. The body turns cold, your hands begin to tremble and get wrinkled. You have severe cramping, terrible abdominal pain and nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Your blood begins to look like tar. And in some cases, it presented with other complications, as well as the feeling of being asphyxiated. And that makes sense as your body begins to lose plasma and there's not enough oxygen circulating through your body. Now, people did recover from this phase, but the 19th century physicians uncovered another one. Now, the second phase of cholera, your body shifts from being really cold to being really warm as fever sets in. Now, the patient becomes delirious. It comes with severe headaches and other complications like pneumonia, and the fatality rate in this case was 50%. So if your body didn't fight it off fast enough and you didn't die from dehydration, and you made it to this point, I mean, it was going to happen. Now, as a result, in many ways, it was the uncertainty of the symptoms and the disruption that really caused on society that made it the most difficult to manage. And this is what really is the biggest challenge in managing an epidemic outbreak. Now, this is a huge challenge to not just the Spanish Crown, but all governments, since spreading information, containing the infection, and eliminating is key when addressing these outbreaks. Now, for the rest of the 19th century, the Spanish Crown would engage in a set of projects attempting to address not just choleric outbreaks, but eliminate potential threats of infection. Now, in chapter 2 of my dissertation, I look at the crafting of a sanitation code. Now, this code is critical in managing the hygienic crisis, since it detailed responsibilities at a local, municipal, regional, and national level. When and how quarantines were to be placed, who decided when they should be lifted, this was all detailed there. As a result, in theory, if an outbreak occurred, everyone should kick in and do their job. In addition, the Crown also sent inspectors and took a national census that focused on where people were, what they did, and what they were dying of beyond cholera. So they really start to expand to look into other high impact infectious diseases. Now, this was an attempt to pinpoint any other areas of potential threats, and it was the first time that the Spanish Crown really analyzed its own population systematically. Now, this is key in preparing. Now, while the census was not perfect and it still left a lot to be desired, it still provided key demographic information. Now, the next project that the Dirección General engaged in was urban planning and public works. Spaces like plazas were regulated to avoid potential threat of infection, and farm animals that usually lived in close proximity to humans were pushed to the outskirts of the city. Now, this really changed the expectations of how cities were supposed to look and be experienced. One of the things that I always remembered is the first time that I went to Texas, I looked out the window and saw someone in a horse, and I was so shocked because I lived in California. I'd never seen anything like that before. And so even our own expectations of how we view cities now kind of come from some of these regulations. Now, the next project that the Dirección General engaged in was in producing hygienic literature and really providing a sanitation education. Now, they produced a lot of advice literature covering all different kinds of topics and attempted to educate population that they may or may not have had access to in the past. Because Spain had low literacy rates and there was limited access to education, educating the population on what to do in moments of crisis was a huge problem. So they began to produce small advice manuals and they were made cheaply and were actually very accessible. Now, I will disclose that many of these manuals were actually aimed at a very specific middle-class person, and that was middle-class wives. It also presents a very bourgeois vision of health, but they were definitely out there. Now, by the end of the 19th century, Spain had very much a well-organized sanitation system. They had institutions that oversaw and monitored sanitation. They had also a very well built up bureaucracy with physicians, inspectors, royal academies, and hygienic literature. They had an early alert system, and they really transformed and regulated space to eliminate potential threats. But in 1918, influenza hit, and this is a very different type of outbreak. Now, this was a disease that many physicians knew. The flu was pretty common, but it had never presented itself the way that it did. But again, it did what it knew how, and it organized. It set up temporary epidemic hospitals, put up alerts about coughing and sneezing in public that you shouldn't do so, but it just really couldn't keep up with the spread and massive death. Influenza, by the way, is one of the more dangerous diseases out there because it mutates very quickly and is very contagious. Now, Spain did everything as well as far as the international community. It kept on reporting on cases and fatalities, as well as conducting research. And it was really in this reporting that ended up giving this specific outbreak of influenza its nickname, calling it the Spanish flu. Now, the rest of the world was really involved in World War I and had census as far as, or they were censured as far as their media, but Spain was not. Now, I want to stop talking about my research here and switch over to discuss COVID-19. Hopefully in discussing and giving a small snapshot of what I do, I've illustrated really the difficulty and challenges in controlling and managing outbreaks. Now, it's time for a mini science lesson. Now, the images that you see on the PowerPoint are actually from one of my favorite animes, and it's called Cells at Work. It's actually on Netflix, and I highly suggest it because it's really accurate in the way that it presents what actually happens in the body, and it does so in a very interesting and visual way. Now, there are very important differences between viruses and bacteria, although both ultimately make you sick. It's really how they affect your body as well as their shape that determines what and if a physician can do anything for you if you get sick. Now, bacteria, which is on the left-hand side, is alive and it can reproduce on its own. When it enters the body, it's really a foreign contaminant that gets you sick. Typically, your body will fight it off, and if it's really bad and you have a really bad infection and you go to the hospital, the doctor might prescribe antibiotics. Now, this will give your body that extra boost to fight off this foreign invader. Now, virus is very different. If you look at the images, the bacteria actually looks really strange, right? It looks like an alien of some sort. The image in the middle, that's a normal cell. That's how it's portrayed in the anime. And then the one on the far right is a virus. Now, you can tell it's the same person, but it looks a little different, right? Now, viruses are not alive. They cannot reproduce by themselves. Now, the way that they enter the body is that they actually hijack your cells and they turn them into other virus-making machines. And so a virus actually, and so when your body starts fighting a virus, it actually begins to attack itself. Now, if you feel really terrible, let's say you get the flu and the flu's over, but you have a lingering cough, it makes sense because your body has been fighting and it's been destroying its own tissues. So it definitely damages your body quite a lot when you get a viral infection of any sort. Now, I have a quick question for you guys. So I'm gonna need someone to unmute themselves. If you have a really, really bad viral infection, can you go to the doctor and can they give you antibiotics to give your body that boost to fight them off? Anybody? I see heads shaking.
No.
Does anybody know?
They don't.
No. Yes. Wait.
Say, is anyone gonna unmute yourselves? I'll wait a minute. No?
No, everybody's second guessing themselves.
Anybody?
I
have
say no.
Do I have volunteer? No? Okay, I will go ahead and explain. Now, actually, they cannot give you anything. The reason for that is that because the virus hijacks your own cells, if we give you antibiotics, it might actually make this virus reproduce much faster. And so your body's basically fighting itself. So that is one of the reasons why we actually can't give you anything when you have a virus. The best that we can do if you have a viral infection of some sort is we can give supportive care. Now, what that means is that if you're dehydrated, we can give you fluids. If you have a fever, we can try to manage your fever, but that is about it. If you have a virus, your body just has to work through it on its own. Now, this lesson is very superficial. There's definitely a lot of detail that I've left out, but I wanted to give a general overview. All right, so now let's begin with our current outbreak of COVID-19. Now, I want to begin with the term coronavirus. Now, there are actually many different strains of coronavirus, and the common cold that sometimes we get, about 30% of those cases are caused by a strain of coronavirus. But this COVID-19 is not just a simple cold. I want to make that very clear. It comes from a cross-species mutation, which means that it shifted from animal to human. Now, I'm not going to disclose the animal where we think it came from. I actually don't think that that's helpful in any way, but we do know that there was a cross mutation at some point. Now, the truth of the matter is that at any given moment, there are hundreds of possible outbreaks around the world. If you guys look at the screen in front of you, this is ProMed. It's an international society for infectious diseases. Just today, there were over 60 alerts. Some of them were about coronaviruses, but a lot of them were not. If you guys look at it, there was an outbreak of African swine fever, there was mouth and foot disease, and there's avian influenza in Germany. So at any given moment, there's dozens and hundreds of outbreaks going on. Some of them are small and self-contained, like maybe a foodborne illness of some sort, and some of them are not. So it really is quite a challenge to figure out when the alarm should be run and when something should happen. Now, I want to walk you guys through, as a historian, how I found out about this and when it became alarming to me, because I feel like there's a bit of confusion in this timeline. Now, I actually found out about this outbreak. Oh, my slides are out of order. There we go. On December 30th. So I actually woke up to an email that discussed an undiagnosed pneumonia from China. Now, it had appeared in the Wuhan seafood market, and that was about it. It was just an unidentified pneumonia. They didn't know where it was coming from, but there wasn't really much information about it. Now, the next email that I got was January 2nd, and the World Health Organization got into contact with Chinese authorities to ask questions about this viral pneumonia. So they knew it was a virus at this point. And they were concerned about where it was coming from, but their main concern was that this was a cross-species transmission. At this point, only about 27 people were affected, and they had all come from that area. So there was a huge assumption that it was the people that had been there that had been affected, and that was it. Pathology tests were on their way, and Hong Kong got on high alert just in case. In addition, there was also mentions of a 2002-2003 SARS outbreak. So people began to kind of tiptoe around this to see what would happen. Now, by January 3rd, there was more cases that they found. Singapore began screening on all arrivals from China, and the Chinese health officials ruled out any common respiratory diseases like influenza, avian flu. And 11 patients that they had in critical condition stabilized, and they began cleaning efforts in this market. Now, at this point, there was no obvious human-to-human transmission, and no medical staff had been infected, but this is really key on this date. Now, by January 5th, we knew some of the symptoms, which was difficulty breathing, fever, and some radiographs showed lesions in both of the lungs. And so we knew that it was a really aggressive respiratory illness. So kind of lower in the lungs, when you get that really, really bad cough that hurts, that's what people thought was happening. Now, public health measures were definitely implemented, and the World Health Organization determined that there was really not enough information to assess if this was going to be a global risk or not. Now, by January 6th through the 8th, there was a slow in the spread, and that's when they finally identified it as a strain of coronavirus of some sort. As I mentioned, there are several strains, so they really weren't sure what was going on. Now, by January 8th, two important things happened. The World Health Organization actually didn't offer any precautionary measures because much of the investigation was still underway. But there was one important change here, and that was that a patient was confirmed by Thai authorities to have this new virus, and they had never been to this Wuhan market. And so there was concern that it was probably spreading in a much different way. Now, in all honesty, it wasn't really until January 19th that we knew that this was spreading from human to human. That's really when we found out what was happening. And this is when we get our first case in the United States. And so as you guys can see, from when I found out in December 30th, up to kind of near the end of January, we really didn't know much about what was going on. Much of the investigation was still underway. A lot of information was still missing. There was still a lot of guesswork as to what was going to happen here. Now, I'm going to look specifically at the US timeline. Now, between December 30th again and January 28th, there was limited information about this virus. By January 29th, there were 5 cases in the United States, but the CDC had already sent out travel warnings, but it was level 1. They were slightly concerned, but not too concerned. Now, there was a high potential of threat because of all the international travel we have, but there was no reason to have a crisis, and there was honestly no real reason to panic. We really didn't think that it would spread within our own population. Now, at this point, we didn't know how long it took to spread or the incubation period, so how long it takes for your body to be overrun with a virus before you get symptoms. Now, it might have been a week or 2, but it was unknown. There was also no real information if you could spread it and you were asymptomatic. So a lot of the screening that actually happens is they take your temperature, but you get a temperature once you have symptoms, not before then. Now, for certain, we knew that it was a virus, and so we can only provide supportive care, and there's no real cure. There was also an alert that if you were feeling sick, that you should call your doctor first before you showed up to an emergency room so that you could be properly isolated. If you were sick, you were asked to stay at home and wash your hands often. That if you were going to cough or sneeze, that you do it in a tissue and to clean common areas. But again, there was no real threat, and no one really thought that it would spread within the United States. Now, by February 5th, the World Health Organization declares a global health emergency. Now, what this really does is that it allows connections amongst research facilities, labs, and more importantly, it unlocks money for research. Now, this was not a true indicator that there was actually a threat to the United States. This just allows them to do more research and continue their investigation. Now, the CDC also declares a national emergency. It starts to take extra precautions and steps to make sure that the virus does not find itself here. It increased screenings, decreased flights. All foreign nationals were not allowed to visit the United States. And if you were coming back from abroad, you were held in quarantine for 14 days. It also started working with the FDA to accelerate testing. Now, at this point, testing could only be done by the CDC, and it took between 24 to 36 hours to get the process done. They were trying to get it down to 4 to 6 hours, as well as allow regional hospitals to do testing. Now, amongst the medical community, there was a huge concern that this virus would actually disproportionately affect low socioeconomic countries that did not have modern healthcare systems, because without supportive care, people would die. And so again, even in early February, there was some concern that it was people traveling internationally that would bring it to the US, but not necessarily that we would have huge outbreaks here. Now, what we knew about the virus at this point was that it affected the lower respiratory tract, so that really thick, really bad cough. While it did have an asymptomatic spread, it seemed that those cases were milder. That's what they thought at that point. Now, the main driver and spread of this was people coming into contact with other people that were sick, which is why they implemented social distancing and asked people to stay at home if they were sick. Now, the virus could also be spread through the digestive tract, and that's the fecal oral route, which is why hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. But we began to see medical equipment concerns. So there were concerns that if we did have an outbreak, we would not have enough medical equipment to treat everybody. Now, by February 18th, the coronavirus actually gets a new name. So it's coronavirus 19, COVID-19. Now, this was done to avoid issues about where the virus came from and animal implications. So there was already concerns that there might be scapegoating, attacks, xenophobia, things like that. Now, there was definitely a huge spike in numbers during this week, but it was because people were being clinically diagnosed. So basically, they weren't worrying about testing in China. If you fit the symptoms, the likelihood was that you had it. Now, again, the primary spread of this, we realized that it was through respiratory droplets, so sneezing, coughing, being close to someone. And vaccine began to be in the works, but we wouldn't hear true results until 18 months from February. Now, the lethality rate or death rate was actually quite mild. These are the numbers that we had at the time. So 81% of cases were mild, 14% of cases were severe or aggressive, and only 5% of cases were critical. Now, come to mid-March, what they realized very quickly was that there were actually not enough testing kits. And this is when the World Health Organization officially declares the COVID-19 a pandemic. So closures, cancellations, etc., were done in order to keep the public safe. And cancellations were definitely a good thing. This meant that they were trying to limit the spread of this virus. And we got news that there might be a vaccine available, but not until 2021. And concerns about run-on hospitals became the biggest issue. So again, there was a concern before that, well, it might not spread here. You know, we were worried about other socioeconomic places not having enough equipment. But then they realized that because we didn't have enough test kits, we didn't actually know how many people were sick. And so there might be a potential that if everyone was getting sick, we wouldn't be able to treat them. Now, unfortunately, I wish I had more news for you guys about the current outgoing threat, but we really don't know what will happen yet. It's really too early to tell. The best that we can do is to continue to follow the CDC guidelines of social distancing and wait for proper testing to increase so that we can get accurate information. The other thing that I would suggest is to avoid misinformation and false dichotomies. I've seen a lot of, we have to leave our homes now or else. But the truth is that, again, we just don't know what's going to happen. It might peter off, but we don't have proper numbers, so we have no way of assessing that. It might not. Even if you are not sick, you guys are actually key in keeping this from spreading. If there's a run on hospitals, the issue that we're really going to run across is that people that actually need medical care will not be able to get it. Now, the last suggestion that I really have for everyone is to stay alert and informed, but be careful with data and numbers, especially in the United States. As I mentioned really early in my talk, we actually don't have accurate numbers. And so I've seen a lot of guesswork into what this will be a month, another month, but the truth is that we actually don't know. Until we can get proper testing, until we actually know what the numbers are, we really don't know when this will end. So hopefully you guys have found this informative, and I'm free for any questions if you guys have some.
Okay, I can hear you. I apologize for that. Sorry.
Awesome.
Okay, questions.
Okay. Hi, Ruth.
Hello.
I had a question on the Spanish, on the cholera in Spain. I don't remember. I guess if you want to go back to the slide, but what you did say the certain sanitation measures they took, like I guess moving animals away from like the main area. But were there things they took in like individual measures they took with the individual people, like yeah, like I guess now you know how now they're like in this day and age they're telling us to wash our hands for 20 seconds, wear masks, all that stuff.
Okay, so definitely. I discuss that more in the chapter about advice literature because you begin to see manuals about everything. Like there are manuals about how to sanitize your water, the proper clothing to wear, underwear, smoking, drinking, what kind of spirits. And so you begin to get that in advice literature. You also get that in towns where you'll have these ladies be like, my neighbor's unhygienic because she doesn't take her laundry down. And so you begin to see some of that language go in there. And inspectors will come in and check your home. So definitely.
Do you know what certain measures, like were there, maybe I didn't hear it again, were there like specific ones that they made them follow?
That they made them follow. So with influenza, it's kind of what we're doing now. It was respiratory ones. So you couldn't sneeze or cough in public, like you were asked not to. You had to cover yourself. For cholera, what they did, that one's slightly different. They basically didn't know where the contaminant was coming from. And so it focused more on cleaning spaces.
Ruth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Dave Peets. I'm just wondering, you know, with your keeping up with the coronavirus presently, I mean, what are the points of resonance for you as you've been studying the situation in 19th century Spain with the cholera outbreak? Have there been themes with the current crisis that that very much resonate? In other words, are there continuities here that have really struck you in terms of how it spread, the kind of social response, that sort of thing?
So I saw a lot of similarities. One thing that I wasn't expecting was hoarding of items, because it didn't happen everywhere. It happened here for sure. And so I actually went back to see if it was occurring in my 19th century Spain, and maybe I just didn't look in the right place, but I didn't seem to find any. I think one of the stark differences that I saw was that my physicians and politicians were very concerned. They needed to stop this as fast as they could. I think part of it was that the idea of revolution was so close in their minds that riots could break out. And so when I saw a lot of misinformation coming from media and politicians, that actually really surprised me. I would have thought that it would be more solidarity to ensure that people wouldn't panic. And I definitely did not see much of that. So that was one thing that always stuck out to me as I did my research, that my 19th century physicians and politicians are like, what more can we do? Where else can we explore? It became really invasive. They definitely got into people's lives a lot, but their huge concern was these citizens. What are they going to do with them?
Thank you.
Of course.
I had a question.
Yes.
I was impressed to hear that, I mean, by the way, I liked your talk a lot.
Oh, thank you.
And I was impressed to hear about the level of preparation that the Spanish crown had gone to in terms of trying to get ahead of what they knew about the cholera slowly reaching them. And yet there was a panic anyway. And I understand that, you know, the gruesomeness of the disease probably fed into that. Did they have any sense about the progress of the disease and its impact on the human body as it was slowly making its way towards them over the course of a year?
So no, the British knew a little bit about it because they had colonial holdings in these areas. So they'd heard about it before, but there was a lot of ideas about this virus. Or about cholera. So one was that it couldn't survive in colder climates because it comes from a much warmer tropical climate, and that it wouldn't work. Another one that I heard was that kind of Western character is so much stronger that it wouldn't be debilitated by an exotic tropical disease of some sort. And so they prepare, but in many ways, also the idea of cholera was common, like, oh, she has a little bit of cholera, but Asiatic cholera and cholera morbos are very different. And so I feel like they didn't really know what to expect, even though they heard that there was these cases happening. And in the newspapers that I've seen, they don't really go into symptoms, they just give you numbers.
Thank you.
But I would have to look further because I definitely didn't spend as much time in the diplomatic archives as I probably should have.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm also having trouble with my headphones, so hi. So Ruth, great talk. I have a question about, I think you mentioned, I think it was about the 1830 cholera, but anyway, you were talking about how certain towns and villages were quarantined and had, you know, sanitary cordons around them. How effective was that? Like, did people get around it? Did they want to get around it? And also, how was it enforced?
So it was enforced with military. So they actually moved soldiers into different areas to enforce these sanitary and quarantines. But the thing about it is that a lot of the physicians that worked with these communities actually really advocated for their towns. And a lot of them were like, it's not working, because they started to starve some towns out. And they were like, this quarantine is not working, it's not helping. And they also couldn't move goods into different areas. And so quarantine doesn't really work against cholera very well, at least once it's inside of the peninsula. It works better if you're kind of keeping ships at docks and waiting. And so they actually, the Spanish crown listens a lot to these physicians. They follow a lot of their recommendations, and they actually break some quarantines much earlier because they realize that people are just dying much faster than they can even attempt to cure them. And so, yeah, quarantine does not work that well against cholera.
Thanks.
I was gonna say, any more questions?
Hi Ruth, this is Mary. Sorry, I'm having problem with my webcam.
No problem.
You won't be able to see me. Did you come across any literature or reports? When did the Chinese government actually notify the Chinese public, the population, about the disease?
About the current COVID-19 outbreak?
My question is about COVID-19, yes.
Okay, so let me go back to my slide because actually, I mean, they announced it really early on. I think I have the data on here. I moved through some of this information a little quickly because it was a lot.
Yes,
But they start cleaning, it's right when they start cleaning. So in January 5th, they have their public health responses. So they begin to isolate people. They begin to look for people that were in close contact. They begin to look for the pathogen, and they begin to actually, I mean, at least from the reports that I've looked at, they begin to let people know that this might be an issue, and that if you feel sick, that they need to see you and you need to come in.
okay,
And so I know that there's some question about the timeline and how it worked out in China, but it's once it leaves really that I think is more relevant for us about the global outbreak. It's just hard to tell.
Early January. Then.
Right.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I have a question about popular literature and just culture in general regarding the Spanish response to cholera. And I know it's part of a different scope, but have you come across it anywhere, just anecdotally? You know, was there like a surplus in like cholera plays? Was cholera like a huge part in the theater, or as a trope in literature?
So there are, it's leaving my mind now, but there are two stories that were written and really popular in Spain where cholera is a catalyst of it. They don't really talk about the symptoms, and they kind of talk about it really casually, like, oh, they got cholera, but then they were and so it's definitely in there, but cholera compared to other outbreaks and smallpox and kind of influenza that comes after has a much shorter lived reign. I mean, its reign is what, like the early 20th century compared to kind of smallpox that was there for a few centuries, the plague, and influenza after. So it just, yeah, it doesn't have as long of a reign, I would say.
It's not as dramatic. It's not like the plague in Sevilla or something like that.
Right.
I gotcha. Thank you.
Of course.
Ruth?
Yes.
This is Sherry Dorwood. I'm in Colorado. Are there any conclusions you can make that would be advice to leaders from what they learned and what you learned about previous pandemics and epidemics?
So this is usually what historians do. So I know the professors that are here will be like, I can only really give my opinion. I feel like for the American case, okay, let me try again. As I showed you guys the timeline, it's really difficult to know when an outbreak is going to occur.
Sure.
To be honest with you, when I saw that it was a pneumonic cold, I was like, oh, an unidentified pneumonic cold. If it had been a flu, it would have raised alarms much quicker. Flu is really the big concern that a lot of epidemiologists and people that look at epidemic outbreaks are concerned about because it mutates much faster. There's this huge reservoir of cross-species mutations. And we saw one in 1918. A chicken and a pig probably had a party, met an American soldier, and we had this huge outbreak. And so flu tends to be much more in the forefront. There's a series on Netflix called Pandemic, and flu is the big thing that they focus on. And so cold, you know, how far it spreads, we also didn't know enough of it. It's just really difficult to know. I feel personally, and from other people that I know, that the mistake was in not testing in the United States as quickly as we did, because it doesn't give us the data that we need in order to assess what's going to happen. So I think that setting up this false dichotomy of when this is going to end or what result we're going to get is a very unfortunate one that we're seeing our politicians make because we don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. The other thing I see in your history is it goes hand in hand with the progression of the science of medicine. You know, microscopy and the ability to see things that are microscopic that you can't see otherwise. You know, that that was a long time in coming, the understanding of germs. And so as that's developed, you would think we'd get better at dealing with pandemics, but it doesn't appear that, does it?
No, and I think that that's why I expressed really early in my talk that there seems to be this gap, right? That we have all this technology, we have all this science, but I think that there's these assumptions that we will automatically understand, that these universal hygienic norms about maybe covering your mouth when you sneeze or cough kind of extend everywhere, or that people would know exactly what to do in a moment of crisis. And I think that a lot needs to be filled out there in how we organize societies, and that deals directly with our history. And so that's why I really think that studying these epidemic outbreaks, introducing them to our students, making them just as important as some of the other things that history worries about, like wars and other crises, is key in really kind of getting people to think about them.
Yeah, yeah. Good talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Curious if there's any lessons to be learned, like how people have responded after a pandemic sort of is less of a threat in terms of how they come together. Like, are they suddenly more afraid of each other and less likely to congregate in groups and looking suspiciously at each other? Or when you're quarantined like this, you miss each other so much and you realize that everyone's human, that after it's all over, you know, people come together and kind of in a more of a social collaborative way, if that makes sense.
So this was a variation that I mentioned in responses to cholera. So in Spain, there was this huge concern about their own citizens. I think part of that comes out of kind of the importance of the church and religion in the Spanish government, and it's an extension of perhaps paternalism to some extent. But in other countries, this doesn't happen. They automatically blame poor women in some areas specifically, or like in the US, they specifically target foreigners in the areas of New York. And so I think it's in those nuances and variations to responses to this threat that we see that these categories aren't stagnant. You do see moments where these physicians use their personal connections in Spain to move goods, to put their own money in. They come out of retirement. They kind of go in the forefront. Many of them didn't get paid during the first outbreak because they were just there on a volunteer basis. And you see their sanitation boards afterwards ask the government to please give them something because they had been so helpful. And so there's really a lot of different responses, and I think seeing that is really fascinating.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Dave Peets here again. I think Laura hit on something really interesting, as you know, for us as historians to think about how. Well, let me ask you the question, I guess, Ruth. I mean, do you see, you know, with any sort of patterns historically in the aftermath of pandemics that we might think about in the current one, about how they have changed the pattern of social interaction, how they perhaps have changed the pattern in individuals' beliefs in institutions? I mean, are there any of these kind of broad sort of social and cultural changes that have occurred with past pandemics that, you know, we might experience with this one?
So you definitely saw, like I mentioned earlier, you saw mass hysteria, scapegoating. I've seen some weird stuff about perhaps religious things that might cure you and prevent you from getting it. So I've seen patterns in those. Like, those are responses that I was surprised to see, but not completely shocked. And you find those with cholera, with smallpox, with other things. I think one important difference is that people forget. With time, forgetting is a really important part in this. With influenza specifically, it caused such huge devastation, and yet we have technically a flu outbreak every season. A lot of people die, and it's like people forget every year. And people tend to forget about Spanish influenza as well. And so I think that there's a certain element of forgetting that also occurs after such a huge moment of devastation, at least when it comes to epidemic outbreak. I'm not sure what to make with that yet. I'm not sure kind of what that means or says, but I think forgetting is a part there as well.
I'm interested in this whole idea of memorialization and memory and so forth. And Steve and I have had some discussions about, you know, the plague in Athens at the end of the 5th century. And there's this really dramatic and powerful description in Thucydides. And we all know, oh yes, the plague in Athens is terrible, terrible. And the sort of war context around that. And he gives the impression of this massive devastation, and yet they go on for several decades of war. So clearly the devastation was mediated in some way. Not everybody died. They were able to recover and relatively quickly too. And people do have referenced the 1918 outbreak and the fact that so many doctors were unable to do anything. And many of them died as well, and how that might have impacted the memory about that, and made it more difficult for people to grasp influenza effectively after that. You have thoughts perhaps on this?
Yeah, so I discussed it briefly the last time I taught the history of epidemics, and I told my students very clearly that this was just me thinking about my dissertation. And I feel like, again, they really did everything they were supposed to for Spain. They reported early, they started recording symptoms. Initially they were like, this is a flu that has gone out of hand. They tried everything, and they were reporting, reaching out internationally, doing everything that they could. And I really saw the system that they had completely failed. And so I was like, in some ways, I wondered if people chose to forget such a devastation because it really put to challenge the ability for them to be protected, that their government couldn't, that their sanitation institutions couldn't, that you could do everything that was being asked of you and that it still might not work. And so I wonder about that sometimes, about what happens when there's something that's so big that you do everything you're supposed to and it just doesn't work. So yeah, I do wonder about that. Again, I don't know what I could do with it, or it doesn't really have a place in the way that I craft my dissertation so far, but I haven't gotten there, so maybe I come up with something. Great. Any more questions?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to share a comment. And that is that during your talk, you used the analogy of seeing a horse rider for the first time in Texas to communicate the mindset of the people back in those times. And I felt the connection. So I just want to thank you for that.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think the other thing that was surprising me is when I hear chickens. Because I'm like, why are they here? Even though, I mean, if you have a permit and you can have them, it's no problem. But this idea that we have certain expectations when we enter space, they really come out of this 19th century moment, right? That you should have running water, that you should have a bathroom, that you should have these things. Even though the reality is that there's a lot of people that actually don't have them across the world and have issues with that in the United States. And so it really bridges a lot of different conversations about access.
And I'm also from California, so I could doubly relate to it.
All right, any more questions? Okay, there don't seem to be any, but thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my research and to have some conversations with you. I apologize about the volume. I'm still trying to figure out my home computer, but thank you again. This is really a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Ruth.
you, Ruth.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.